Caleb Hardwick came to Shadow Ridge to forget. The Tacoma rolled north through Arizona desert that seemed to stretch forever flat and empty under a sky the color of old steel. Rain had threatened all morning but never delivered, leaving the air thick and restless. Caleb kept both hands on the wheel, eyes fixed on the white line disappearing under the hood. Beside him, Maverick sat upright in the passenger seat, amber eyes scanning the horizon the way he had done on 100 patrols in places Caleb tried not to remember. The dog's tan and black fur caught the pale light filtering through the clouds. His ears swiveled, occasionally tracking sounds Caleb couldn't hear. Even in retirement, Maverick remained vigilant. The letter sat folded on the dashboard, held in place by a pair of scratched sunglasses. Caleb had read it enough times to memorize every word, but it still felt unreal. Dear Mr. Hardwick, we regret to inform you of the passing of Dorothy Hardwick. You have been named her sole heir. Please contact our office regarding the transfer of property. Dorothy, his grandmother. The woman who'd lived tucked away in the Colorado mountains too far from the rest of the world for anyone to check on her. The one person in his family who had tried quietly and imperfectly to reach out when he was younger. He had never written back. Not once. Now she was gone. The highway climbed as they crossed into Colorado trading desert scrub for pine forests that pressed close to the road. The air turned cooler, sharper. Maverick shifted slightly, nose-testing the breeze through the cracked window. Caleb glanced at him. You feel it too. The dog's ears flicked forward, not alarmed, just aware. They drove on. Late afternoon brought them through a narrow valley dotted with abandoned mining structures, their rusted skeletons clinging to hillsides like monuments to a prosperity that had dried up decades ago. The GPS lost signal an hour back. Caleb navigated by memory, now following landmarks he hadn't seen in 20 years. The town of Shadow Ridge appeared slowly rising out of the trees like something reluctant to be found. A wooden sign swung in the wind, its paint peeling but still legible. Welcome to Shadow Ridge, population 612. Caleb slowed the truck, rolling down Main Street at 15 miles per hour. The town looked smaller than he remembered. A handful of storefronts lined both sides of the road. A diner with a flickering neon sign that read, The Miner's Rest. A hardware store with plywood covering one window. A post office with an American flag snapping in the wind. Most of the buildings showed their age-weathered wood and cracked windows patched with duct tape. Near the corner, a professional sign caught his eye: Kane and Kane Law, Victor Kane Esquire, and Evelyn Kane Environmental Law. Caleb filed that away without thinking much of it. A few locals paused on the sidewalk to watch the Tacoma pass. Their gazes lingered not on Maverick, who sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, but on Caleb himself, on his face, his bearing, the way he held himself. One elderly man sweeping snow off his porch stopped, mid-stroke, staring. Caleb kept driving. The road leading to Dot's property wound up the eastern ridge, growing steeper with every turn. Tall pines surrounded them, their branches nearly brushing the truck as if the forest were closing in. Maverick's nose worked constantly now, processing scents Caleb couldn't begin to identify. Eventually, the last sign of town disappeared behind them. The headlights cut through fog and falling snow, illuminating a narrow path carved along the mountainside. A final bend brought them to a clearing. There it was. The cabin stood beneath a towering granite cliff, its roof blanketed in snow, its stone chimney rising like a solitary sentinel against the darkening sky. The porch sagged slightly on one side but held together. A single metal wind chime hung from a beam, turning silently in the cold. Tall pines crowded the edges of the clearing, forming a natural wall that made the place feel both sheltered and isolated. Caleb cut the engine. For a moment, the world fell unbelievably quiet. Only the soft patter of snow and Maverick's steady breathing filled the air. Well, Caleb murmured. She wasn't kidding about remote. He stepped out into the cold, pulling his olive field jacket tighter. The jacket was old, worn at the elbows, the kind of gear that had seen too many missions to ever be thrown away. Beneath it, he wore a red and navy flannel shirt faded from years of washing. His cargo pants were the same green he'd worn overseas, and his boots scuffed brown leather, left deep prints in the snow. Maverick jumped down beside him, landing silently despite the fresh powder. The dog moved in a careful arc around the porch, nose low, tail straight. He checked corners, the path to the outhouse, the base of the cliff, before returning to Caleb's side. A full sweep, quick, thorough, practiced. No threats, Caleb asked. Maverick sat watching him with serious eyes. Not alarmed, not relaxed, neutral readiness. Caleb walked to the door. A tarnished brass key waited under a smooth river stone, exactly where the lawyer's letter had said it would be. The lock turned with a slow, hollow click. He pushed the door open. Cold air breathed out from the darkness, carrying with it a faint mixture of pine-old books and something he couldn't quite name. Something that felt like time. He reached for the flashlight on his belt and stepped inside. Maverick padded in beside him, silent and steady. The interior was dim, but as the beam swept across the room, details emerged. A coat hung neatly on a wooden peg by the door. A cup sat beside the sink. A knitted blanket was folded across the back of a rocking chair. Dust lay thick on every surface, yet nothing appeared disturbed. It looked like Dot had stepped out for a few minutes and simply never returned. Caleb felt a shift in his chest, an ache he didn't want to acknowledge. He had barely known her. A few childhood summers spent here running through these woods with a freedom he'd never found anywhere else. Then his father's drinking had gotten worse, and the visits stopped. Now standing in her home, surrounded by the small reminders of her presence, something complicated stirred inside him. Guilt, maybe? Regret? A sense of loss he hadn't expected. Maverick moved ahead, nose to the floorboards, posture tightening with every step. "What is it?" Caleb asked softly. The dog didn't respond, too focused, tail rigid. He traced a path toward the table, circled twice, then paused near the old stone fireplace. He let out a faint whine, the kind he used when identifying something unfamiliar but not dangerous. Caleb crouched beside him, scanning the room again. The place was still silent, but something about the silence felt unnatural, too complete, too heavy, like it had been held there for years without escaping. He stood and walked slowly through the main room, feeling Maverick's shadow at his heels. A narrow hallway led to a small kitchen area, then a bedroom at the back. A wooden ladder led to a loft above. Everything inside was well-worn yet tidy, like Dot had lived a simple and orderly life. But beneath the order was something else. A hush that made Caleb's broad skin prickle. His PTSD stirred unexpectedly. Not violently, just a low pressure behind his ribs, the kind he'd felt on long night patrols when the world held its breath right before something moved. For a moment, the cabin walls seemed to close in. The smell of dust became the smell of sand. The quiet became the quiet before an explosion. He focused on Maverick's presence, grounding himself the way therapists had taught him. The dog's steady breathing, the warmth of his body nearby, the reality of the moment. Maverick nudged his hand, a soft, deliberate touch. "I'm good," Caleb whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. He walked to the window beside the kitchen table. The view looked out over the valley, a sea of dark pines and rolling fog. If someone stood in those woods watching, he wouldn't be able to see them through the snow. He didn't like that thought. Maverick didn't either. The dog remained close, head high, staring out into the dusk as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Caleb took a slow breath. "This is home for now," he said quietly, maybe speaking more to himself than to Maverick. "We'll sort it out. Whatever she left, whatever happened here, we'll figure it out." Maverick's ear twitched, acknowledging the words. Caleb walked to the fireplace and brushed a layer of dust from the mantel. A framed photo leaned against the stone. A younger Dot standing in front of this same cabin, holding a basket of herbs. Beside her was a man Caleb didn't recognize. Tall and thin, with a kind smile. He reached out to pick up the photo, but before his fingers touched the frame, Maverick stiffened. The dog's body went still, eyes locked on the far corner of the room. Caleb followed his gaze. There beside the old dresser along the bedroom wall, a faint seam in the wood caught the light of his flashlight. A seam he hadn't noticed a moment ago. A seam that didn't belong. A quiet pulse of unease rippled through him. He didn't investigate. Not yet. Not tonight. Instead, he stepped back, turned on his heel, and said softly, "Let's set camp, Maverick. We'll check everything in the morning." But even as he said it, he knew the house held something. And it had been waiting a long time. Night settled over the ridge like a heavy blanket. The wind pressed against the windows, carrying the low rustling of pine branches that scraped softly along the cabin's weathered boards. Caleb built a small fire in the stone fireplace, its orange glow pushing back the shadows that had crept into every corner of the room. Maverick lay near the hearth, his head resting on his paws, eyes open, tracking every sound. Caleb could tell the dog wasn't resting. His ears twitched at every pop of the burning wood, every sigh of the wind. He was listening, evaluating, waiting. Caleb unrolled his sleeping bag on the old couch and sat down slowly. The warmth of the fire eased some of the stiffness in his shoulders, but the knot of unease remained. The faint seam he'd spotted near the dresser lingered in the back of his mind like an unfinished sentence. He rubbed his face, trying to settle his thoughts. "We'll check it in the morning," he muttered to himself. "Too tired now." Maverick's ears pricked at the sound of Caleb's voice, but the dog didn't move. The fire crackled quietly. Caleb leaned back, letting the soft warmth wash over him. He tried to focus on the ordinary things. the smell of burning wood, the familiar creak of the floorboards, the comforting presence of Maverick nearby. But memories crawled in around the edges. Nights overseas when silence meant danger. Moments before an ambush when the world seemed to hold its breath. The feeling of sand between his fingers as he knelt beside Marcus, pressing his hands against a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. "Get out, Caleb," Marcus had whispered, blood on his lips. "Don't stay for me." But Caleb had stayed, and Marcus had died anyway. He closed his eyes just for a moment, trying to push the memory away. A sudden sound shattered the quiet, a sharp scratching. Quick, urgent, deliberate. Caleb bolted upright. Maverick was already on his feet, body rigid, a deep growl vibrating in his chest. The dog moved across the room in seconds, stopping at the old chest of drawers pressed against the far wall. The scratching came again. This time it was from inside the cabin, inside the wall. Caleb grabbed his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the dresser. Maverick pawed at the floor, then at the wood, his nose pressed tight against the seam Caleb had noticed earlier. "You've got something," Caleb whispered. He approached slowly, the way he used to approach a suspicious object overseas. Measured steps, steady breath, every sense alert. He placed a hand on Maverick's back. The dog's muscles were coiled, ready. Caleb crouched and ran his fingertips along the seam. The wood was old but not warped. A faint draft seeped through the edges. "Hidden panel," he murmured. He pushed gently. Nothing budged. Maverick scratched again, two sharp, insistent strokes, then looked at Caleb as if to say, "Here. Right here." Caleb moved the dresser aside, bracing his legs to slide the heavy furniture with minimal noise. Dust rose in a soft cloud, drifting through the beam of his flashlight. Once the dresser cleared the space, he knelt again and pressed along the panel until his fingers found a loose edge. The wood clicked. Soft, subtle. The panel shifted inward. A small, dark cavity revealed itself, no larger than a shoebox, but deep enough to hold something long hidden. The air inside smelled of oiled cloth and age. Caleb reached in carefully, his fingertips brushing cold metal. He pulled out a rusted lockbox wrapped in layers of faded oiled cloth. It was heavier than it looked. Maverick backed up slightly, watching with steady, unblinking attention. Caleb set the box on the table. The firelight flickered over its dented surface. The lock was old but intact. He took a moment before opening it, steadying his breath. "Let's see what you've been hiding, Dot," he whispered. He unfastened the latch. The lid creaked open. Inside lay a collection of objects, carefully arranged, preserved, as if someone had known they would matter someday. Black and white photographs, edges curled. A stack of newspaper clippings. Several handwritten notes tied with twine. And bundles of old bills, thick and faded with age. Caleb lifted the top newspaper clipping. The headline struck him like a physical blow. "Relief funds missing. Local woman vanishes." His grandmother's name appeared in the second line. Dorothy Hardwick accused of mishandling money after the 1964 mudslide disaster. Rumors, disappearance, investigation pending. Caleb stared at the words, jaw tightening. "That's why they looked at me in town," he muttered. Maverick pressed his broad head against Caleb's thigh, sensing the shift in his emotions. Caleb pulled out the second clipping. Another headline, another accusation, another hint that Dot had fled before she could be questioned. No wonder the Hardwick name made people whisper. He reached for the handwritten notes. The ink had faded, but Dot's handwriting was strong and decisive. He didn't read them yet. Not now. He needed a clearer mind first. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the lockbox. This wasn't some minor secret. This was a scandal. The kind that carved deep wounds in a small town. And his grandmother had carried the weight of it alone. Maverick let out a soft whine. Caleb looked down at him. "You found this," Caleb said quietly. "You knew." The dog tilted his head as if acknowledging the truth without pride. The cabin creaked suddenly, the wind pressing hard against the back wall. Caleb scanned the room, heart thudding. Nothing moved except the fire. No footsteps, no shadows shifting where they shouldn't. Still the unease remained. Something wasn't right. This house had been holding his breath for decades. And Maverick had just broken the seal. Caleb closed the lockbox and set it gently on the table. "We're not alone in this, buddy," he whispered. "There's more buried here, and we're going to find it." Maverick settled beside him but didn't close his eyes. The dog kept watch ears rotating toward every sound outside. And Caleb knew that whatever his grandmother had been hiding, the first layer had only just been uncovered. Morning arrived with a thin wash of gray light across the cabin windows. Snow had settled in a fragile crust on the porch, and the air inside felt colder than it had the night before. Caleb stirred the embers in the fireplace, coaxing a small flame back to life before grabbing his coat. "Come on, Maverick," he said. "We need supplies. And answers." Maverick stretched, shook out his fur, and trotted beside him as they stepped outside. The sky hung low, swollen with more snow to come. Their breath fogged in the air, drifting upward like faint smoke. Before leaving, Caleb decided to test something. He grabbed 2 tent poles and a tarp from the truck bed and attempted to construct a basic lean-to shelter against the cabin wall. Within 5 minutes, the structure listed 20 degrees to the left, one corner sagging pathetically. Maverick sat 10 feet away watching. The dog's head tilted slowly to one side, perfectly mirroring the angle of the collapsing tent. Caleb turned to look at him. "What?" Maverick blinked. Once, slowly, then turned his head away as if the spectacle was too painful to witness. Caleb couldn't help but smile. "Yeah, well, I'm a better shot than I am a carpenter." Maverick's tail remained motionless, judgment rendered. The drive into Shadow Ridge took them along the same winding road they'd traveled the night before. But in daylight, everything felt sharper, more exposed. The trees seemed taller, the ravine deeper, the silence heavier. Maverick kept his nose working through the cracked window, cataloging every new scent. Caleb parked near the town's small main square. The diner's neon sign buzzed weakly in the frosty air. A hardware store stood across the street next to the post office with its American flag snapping in the wind. The few locals out and about paused as Caleb stepped onto the sidewalk. Their gazes lingered, not on Maverick, who trotted obediently at his side, but on Caleb himself, on his gray-blue eyes, on the way he moved, economical and alert. Some looked startled. Others whispered. Caleb straightened his shoulders. He had walked into villages overseas where people whispered too, but this felt different. It felt personal. The diner's bell jingled softly when Caleb pushed the door open. Warmth rolled out, warmth in the smell of bacon, coffee, and old wood. A handful of patrons sat at booths and tables murmuring over breakfast plates. The moment Caleb stepped inside the room, fell into a hush. He walked to the counter. Maverick settled at his feet, posture crisp and attentive. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with silver hair tied back in a bun, approached him with a polite but guarded smile. "What can I get you, hun?" "Coffee to start," Caleb said. "And maybe some information." She paused halfway through pouring. "Information. I'm here about Dorothy Hardwick. She was my grandmother." The mug froze in her hand. 3 men in a booth near the window shifted uneasily. A younger woman at a corner table looked down, pretending she wasn't listening. The waitress finally set the coffee down, her eyes softening just a touch. "Your grandmother," she kept to herself. "Folks around here talked more than they should have." "What did they say?" Caleb asked. Before she could answer, an older man approached slowly from the end of the counter. His hair was white, his face weathered like cracked leather, and he wore suspenders over a thick wool shirt. He moved with the careful gait of someone whose body had spent decades doing hard labor. "You must be Caleb," the man said gently. "I'm Horace Pike. I knew Dot." Caleb nodded. "I was hoping someone here did." Horace glanced around before lowering his voice. "Your grandma wasn't the villain people made her out to be. Be careful who you trust." Caleb's brow tightened. "Why?" "Because not everyone in this town wants the past dug up." Horace touched his arm lightly, his expression grave. "Some folks built their lives on what happened to your grandmother." The waitress returned with a plate of bacon. She set it on the counter, then glanced at Maverick. "He looks like a good boy," she said, reaching for a piece. Maverick's nose twitched. He leaned forward, sniffed the greasy bacon delicately, then turned his head away with the dignity of a sommelier rejecting cheap wine. The waitress blinked. "Well, I never." Caleb hid a smile. "He only eats what I give him. Military training." "Picky thing, isn't he?" Maverick's ear flicked. Insult noted. Horace chuckled softly, but his expression grew serious again. He leaned closer to Caleb. "There's something you should know," he said quietly. "Your grandmother tried to speak up about what happened after the mudslide in '64. She had proof, documents, evidence, but powerful people made sure she couldn't use it." "Who?" Horace's eyes shifted toward the window. Caleb turned and saw a dark pickup parked across the street, the same one from yesterday. Squeamian, its engine idled, exhaust curling into the cold air. The windows were tinted so deeply he couldn't see the driver. It stayed there, unmoving, watching. Maverick's growl rumbled low, vibrating against Caleb's boots. The dog had not looked away from the truck. Horace pressed a napkin into Caleb's hand. On it was written an address. "Come see me tonight," Horace whispered. "I have something you need to hear." The diner fell silent again. The wind rattled the windows. Caleb paid the bill and stepped outside with Maverick. The cold slapped his face sharp enough to clear his thoughts. The dark pickup still idled at the curb. Caleb walked toward his truck, Maverick glued to his side. The driver's window lowered just an inch, just enough for Caleb to sense eyes behind the glass. Then without warning, the pickup rolled forward, tires crunching over snow, and drove off toward the northern trail without so much as a glance. Maverick growled deep in his chest until the truck vanished behind a wall of trees. Caleb scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but the whole town felt like it was staring. Listening for his next move, he opened his truck door. "We're not welcome," he murmured. Maverick climbed in first, still watching the road. Caleb looked back toward the diner. Horace stood at the door, his hand pressed to the glass as though he had something more to say, but he didn't step outside. Instead, he gave Caleb a small, knowing nod. A warning, a plea, or maybe both. Caleb started the engine. "We're getting close to something, Maverick," he said quietly as they pulled away from Shadow Ridge. "And they know it." Maverick settled into his seat, gaze locked forward. The town shrank in the rearview mirror, but the feeling of eyes watching followed them all the way back into the woods. The tension hadn't lifted. It had only grown deeper, sharper, heavier. By the time Caleb and Maverick reached the cabin, the last traces of daylight had vanished behind the ridge. A thin layer of fresh snow covered the clearing, glowing faintly under the pale moon filtering through the clouds. Caleb stepped out of the truck, breath fogging in the cold mountain air. Maverick jumped down beside him, rigid ears pricked forward. The dog had already picked up something, an unfamiliar scent, a disturbance. Caleb followed Maverick's gaze toward the cabin door. It was open, just slightly, but definitely open. Caleb froze, his pulse tightening. He knew he had locked it. A faint memory rose. The first rule on patrol: if something is off, assume danger until proven otherwise. "Stay close," he whispered. Maverick moved low and silent, the same way he used to during night operations. Caleb approached from the side, avoiding the direct line of the doorway, flashlight held low and angled. The snow near the entryway was disturbed. 2 sets of footprints, one fresh, one fading. Someone had been here not long ago. Caleb steadied his breathing. The pressure behind his ribs, the early thrum of a flashback, began creeping in. He closed his eyes for half a second, grounding himself the way he'd practiced. Maverick nudged the back of his knee, snapping him back to the present. They slipped inside. The air in the cabin felt colder than the outside, as if the warmth had been sucked out by whoever forced their way in. The fire from the morning was dead. The ashes had been disturbed. Maverick moved ahead, nose close to the floor, following an invisible trail. Caleb swept the flashlight across the room. Chaos. Papers scattered across the floor. Drawers pulled open. The lockbox overturned, its lid hanging open. He crouched beside it. Nothing inside appeared stolen, but everything had been examined. Whoever broke in wasn't after money. They were searching for something specific. Maverick moved toward the table, posture tightening again. He stopped beside a piece of paper left in the center, placed there deliberately. Caleb picked it up. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, written with a heavy hand. "Stop digging. Leave now. Last warning." V-kick. His chest tightened. Not with fear, but with something sharper, colder. Anger flickered at the edges of his calm. The old life, the missions, the threats, the games of intimidation. It all rose in his memory. He didn't try to suppress it this time. Maverick let out a low growl deep in his throat. Caleb stood again, scanning the room, replaying every detail. Whoever broke in had known exactly where to look. Someone with knowledge of the cabin, someone with the stake in what Dot hid, and someone who believed they could frighten him off. They didn't know him well. He moved through the cabin, checking corners and entry points. The back window had been pried open with something thin but strong. A flat tool, maybe? The wood frame bore fresh scratches. Snow beneath the window had been disturbed too. Footprints leading back toward the woods. Maverick followed the prints to the door, barking once, sharp and angry. Caleb placed a hand on the dog's back. "Easy, they're gone." But his own pulse was still high. He forced himself to inhale, slowly drawing in air until the tremor behind his ribs quieted. The last thing he needed was a flashback hitting him blind. He walked back to the table, staring at the note. VK Victor Kane. He folded the note and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Maverick suddenly lifted his head, ears locked toward the woods. A faint sound drifted through the trees, far off but unmistakable. The rumble of an engine starting, a vehicle pulling away. Someone had waited long enough to make sure Caleb saw the message. "You hear that?" Caleb whispered. Maverick growled quietly, then looked back at Caleb as if asking what came next. Caleb moved toward the window, peering out at the dark stretch of forest. Snowflakes drifted lazily in the moonlight, masking everything beyond a few yards. Whoever had been here knew the terrain well, knew how to move through the shadows. He stepped back, rubbing a thumb across the edge of the note. "This wasn't random," he said softly. "They wanted us to know they were here." Maverick exhaled sharply, restless. Caleb began cleaning up the scattered papers, but his hands paused when he lifted one of Dot's clipped newspaper articles. It was folded open to the same headline from earlier: "Relief Funds Missing." He stared at it for a long moment. "Whatever she found back then," he murmured, "someone's still protecting it." He collected the documents, placed them back in the lockbox, and snapped the lid shut. This time he tucked the box beneath a loose floorboard near his sleeping bag. Not its original hiding spot, but somewhere the intruder wouldn't expect. Maverick circled twice and lay beside him, though he didn't relax. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the front door. Caleb sat on the edge of the couch, rubbing the back of his neck. His breath still felt shallow, but he managed to steady it again. He wasn't leaving. Not after this. Not after Dot had carried this burden alone. He glanced at Maverick. "We dig deeper now," he murmured. "They should have left us alone." Outside, the wind picked up, rushing across the cabin roof like a warning, whispered in the dark. Caleb lay down, but his eyes stayed open long after the fire faded, listening for any shift in the night. Maverick didn't sleep at all. Neither did Caleb. The static crackle of the old radio sitting on the cabin's windowsill broke the early morning silence. Caleb had found it the night before, a weathered AM receiver Dot must have used to keep track of the outside world. He'd turned it on out of habit, the same way he used to monitor comms on deployment. The voice that came through was thin, distorted by distance and mountains. 9-year-old Jesse Holloway reported missing near the restricted zone north of Shadow Ridge. Last seen yesterday afternoon. Search teams are forming. Anyone with information, please contact the sheriff's office immediately. Caleb sat up slowly, the words cutting through the fog of exhaustion. Maverick was already on his feet, ears forward, body angled toward the door. Caleb stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the dense forest beyond the clearing. The restricted zone. He'd seen it marked on old maps in the cabin, a section of land cordoned off after some mining incident decades ago. He looked down at Maverick. The dog's amber eyes were locked on him, waiting. Caleb exhaled slowly. He'd come here to escape, to forget, to hide from the mistakes that had cost Marcus his life. But a 9-year-old boy was missing, and Maverick knew what that meant. "We help first," Caleb said quietly, "then we deal with the rest." Maverick moved to the door immediately, tail straight, body coiled with purpose. Caleb grabbed his jacket, checked his gear, and tucked a canteen and emergency kit into his pack. He folded the note from Victor Kane and slipped it into his breast pocket, then locked the cabin behind him. The Tacoma roared to life, and they headed north. The restricted zone lay 3 miles past the town, accessible only by old logging roads that hadn't been maintained in years. Caleb drove slowly, navigating ruts and fallen branches, while Maverick sat alert, processing every scent through the window. When the road became impassable, Caleb parked and they continued on foot. The forest here felt different, older. The trees grew taller, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches blocking out most of the sky. The ground was uneven, covered in moss and rotting logs. No birds sang, no wind moved through the branches, just silence. Caleb pulled a small fleece jacket from his pack. It belonged to Jesse Holloway. The boy's mother had handed it to the search coordinator at the staging area, and Caleb had volunteered to take Maverick into the restricted zone while the others swept the easier terrain. He crouched down and held the jacket out to Maverick. "Find him." Maverick buried his nose in the fabric, inhaling deeply. His entire body shifted, ears forward, muscles taut, eyes sharp. Then he turned and moved into the forest. Caleb followed. Maverick worked methodically, nose to the ground, occasionally lifting his head to test the air. He didn't rush, didn't wander. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, the result of years of training and instinct honed in the most dangerous places on Earth. Caleb stayed close, watching the terrain, scanning for hazards. The forest floor was littered with deadfall and hidden ravines. One wrong step could mean a broken ankle or worse. Maverick stopped suddenly, ears snapping to the left. Caleb froze. The dog moved forward again, faster now, weaving between trees with increasing urgency. Then Caleb heard it, a faint sound, weak, barely audible over the wind, crying. Maverick broke into a run. Caleb followed, boots pounding against the frozen ground, branches whipping past his face. They emerged into a small clearing where a massive pine had fallen, its trunk split and splintered. Beneath the tangle of branches, partially hidden by shadow, a small figure huddled against the cold. Jesse Holloway, 9 years old, brown hair matted with dirt and snow. His face pale lips tinged blue. His right leg was pinned beneath a smaller branch, the ankle swollen and scraped. Maverick reached him first, moving carefully around the debris. The dog lay down beside the boy, pressing his warm body against Jesse's side. Jesse's eyes fluttered open. He looked at Maverick, then up at Caleb, confusion and relief warring on his face. "It's okay," Caleb said, keeping his voice calm. "We're here to help." He knelt beside the boy, assessing the injury. The ankle wasn't broken, but it was badly sprained. The branch holding it down was light enough to move. Caleb worked quickly, using his field training to stabilize the ankle with an elastic wrap from his kit. He covered Jesse with his own jacket, then carefully lifted the branch away. Jesse winced but didn't cry out. "You're doing great," Caleb said. "What's your name?" "Jesse." "I'm Caleb. This is Maverick." The boy looked at the dog, who hadn't moved from his side. "Is he a police dog?" "He's better," Caleb said. "He's a soldier." Maverick's tail thumped once against the ground. Caleb radioed the search coordinator with their location, then fashioned a makeshift sling to help Jesse walk. The boy leaned heavily on him, but with Maverick leading the way, they made slow, steady progress back toward the logging road. By the time they emerged from the forest, a small crowd had gathered. Jesse's mother ran forward as tears streaming down her face and pulled her son into her arms. The search coordinator, a burly man in his 50s, clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "Good work, damn good work." Others echoed the sentiment. A few people took photos. Someone mentioned calling the local paper. Caleb stepped back, uncomfortable with the attention. He caught Maverick's eye, and the dog moved to his side, immediately sensing his unease. As the crowd began to disperse, a figure approached from the edge of the clearing. Victor Kane. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit, wool coat draped over his shoulders, leather gloves on his hands. His silver hair was combed neatly back, and his expression was carefully neutral. "Mr. Hardwick," Victor said, extending a hand. "That was a remarkable thing you did." Caleb didn't take the hand, just doing what needed to be done. Victor lowered his hand slowly, his smile never wavering. "Of course, you're a good man. This town needs people like you." He paused, studying Caleb's face. "That's why I'm offering $600,000 for your land. A fresh start. Somewhere easier. Somewhere safer." Caleb met his gaze. "What's under my land?" Victor's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. "Just trees, Mr. Hardwick. But your grandmother's memory, it's complicated. Selling would be a mercy for everyone." Maverick growled, low, barely audible, but unmistakable. Victor glanced at the dog, then back at Caleb. "Think about it," he said. "I'll be in touch." He turned and walked back toward a black SUV parked on the road. Caleb watched him go, the note from the night before burning in his pocket. "We're not selling," he murmured to Maverick. The dog's tail flicked once. "Agreement." They climbed into the Tacoma and drove back toward the cabin, the weight of Victor's offer sitting heavy between them. But Caleb's mind was already elsewhere, on the lockbox, on the newspaper clippings, on the truth Dot had hidden for 60 years, and on the people who would do anything to keep it buried. The cabin felt colder when they returned. Caleb built a fire and sat at the small kitchen table, the lockbox open in front of him. He pulled out the bundle of handwritten notes, untying the twine carefully. The first page was a journal entry written in Dot's strong, firm handwriting. October 30th, 1964. "They're blaming me. I knew they would. Victor's father came to the house yesterday. He said the missing funds were my responsibility. He said if I spoke a word of the truth, I'd lose everything, but I cannot stay silent. I will hide what I know. One day someone will need it." Caleb read the words twice before setting the page down, exhaling slowly. Dot hadn't just been caught in some misunderstanding. She had been targeted, pressured, threatened, and she had chosen to protect evidence rather than protect herself. Maverick stepped closer, resting his chin on Caleb's thigh. The dog's steady warmth grounded him. Another entry read, November 12, 1964. "Victor's father offered me money. He said if I disappeared quietly, the town would forget. I refused. He called me foolish. But I know what they did. I know whose hands stole from the victims. If the truth dies with me, then the town dies with it." A cold knot formed in Caleb's stomach. He sifted through the remaining pages. Some were journal entries. Others were letters Dot had written but never sent. One was addressed to Caleb's father, though the envelope had never been opened. His hands trembled slightly when he held that one. He didn't open it. Not yet. Not until he understood the full story. Maverick let out a quiet huff, turning toward the window. His body stiffened again. Caleb followed his gaze. Snowflakes drifted lazily outside, but nothing moved beyond the glass. "It's okay," Caleb whispered, though he wasn't certain. He returned to the box and lifted a stack of old photos, black and white images of the town from decades ago. Flooded streets, destroyed homes, volunteers working with shovels and buckets. And there in one photo, three figures standing near a relief station. Dorothy Hardwick, young, strong, her eyes bright even in grayscale. A man Caleb didn't recognize, tall and thin with kind eyes. And Victor Kane's father, younger but unmistakable, standing with one foot angled away from the camera like someone hiding discomfort. Caleb set the photos aside. This wasn't just about money, he said under his breath. This was about power. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing the back of his neck. A familiar heaviness crept through his chest, tightening the air around him. It was the same sensation that sometimes flickered through him when old memories pressed in. The sound of explosions, the sight of Marcus falling, the feeling of being responsible for things beyond his control. Maverick pressed his head more firmly against Caleb's leg, warm and insistent. Caleb took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Thanks, partner. He returned to the table and opened the final letter in the stack. The handwriting was shakier than the earlier pages, written years later. If you are reading this, it means the truth survived longer than I expected. I pray you are stronger than I was. I pray you are not afraid. They wanted the money. They took it from the people who needed it most. And when I tried to stop them, they made sure I was alone. Caleb swallowed hard. Dot hadn't left to save herself. She had left to save the evidence. He glanced toward the dresser where the panel had been hidden for decades. She had worked alone, lived alone, died alone, but she had kept the truth safe long enough for him to find it. He stood and walked to the window. The forest outside felt endless, dark green pines rising against the distant ridge. Somewhere out there, someone had broken into the cabin, someone who still feared what Dot left behind. We can't run from this, Caleb said quietly. Maverick pressed against his leg in agreement. He turned back to the table, grabbed his coat, and tucked the journal pages into the inner pocket. He scanned the room once more, recognizing the weight of the history within its walls. As they stepped outside, the wind sliced across the clearing. The sky had darkened again, thick snow clouds gathering above the pines. Maverick scanned the tree line, his body angled forward, senses sharp. Caleb locked the cabin behind them. What you did, he said softly, thinking of Dot, you didn't do for yourself, and now we finish what you started. Maverick barked once, low, steady, ready for whatever came next. The mountain wasn't silent anymore, and the truth felt closer than ever. Caleb drove into Shadow Ridge the next morning with a singular purpose. He needed someone who could recover data from old electronics. The USB drive he'd found in the lockbox was damaged, its casing cracked. But if there was anything salvageable inside, he needed to know. The town looked different in daylight, less threatening, more worn, just a collection of tired buildings clinging to a history that wouldn't let go. He found what he was looking for on a side street behind the hardware store, a small garage with a hand-painted sign, Greer Electronics and Repair. Caleb parked and stepped inside Maverick at his heel. The interior smelled of solder and oil. Workbenches lined the walls covered in dismantled radios, old computers, and circuit boards. A man stood at the far end, bent over a television set, a screwdriver in one hand. He looked up when Caleb entered. Silas Greer was in his mid-50s with long gray hair pulled back in a ponytail and a thick beard that hadn't been trimmed in weeks. He wore oil-stained coveralls and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "Help you?" he asked, his voice carrying the slow drawl of Appalachian heritage. Caleb held up the USB drive. "Can you recover data from this?" Silas took it, turning it over in his hands, inspecting the damage. "Might be able to. Depends on how bad the internals are." He glanced up at Caleb. "You're Dot Hardwick's grandson." It wasn't a question. "I am." Silas nodded slowly. "Your grandma was a saint. These vultures ran her off." He set the USB down on his workbench. "I'll do what I can. Come back in 2 hours." Caleb hesitated. "What do you know about what happened to her?" Silas removed his glasses, cleaning them on his shirt. "Same thing everyone knows. She tried to do the right thing. They made sure she paid for it." "Who's they?" "The Kanes, Victor's father first, then Victor himself when he took over." Silas put his glasses back on. "You start digging, son, you're going to find bones. Literal ones." Caleb felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. 2 hours, Silas repeated. Caleb and Maverick left the shop and walked toward the edge of town where a small residential street gave way to a cluster of older homes. Horace Pike's house sat at the end of the lane, a modest single-story structure with a covered porch and a weathered rocking chair. Caleb knocked. The door opened slowly and Horace appeared leaning on a wooden cane. His face brightened when he saw Caleb. "Come in," he said. The interior was warm, heated by a wood stove in the corner. Photographs lined the walls, images of Shadow Ridge in its prime, the railroad, the mines, families gathered in front of homes that no longer existed. Horace gestured to a chair and Caleb sat. Maverick settled at his feet, watchful but calm. "I knew you'd come," Horace said, lowering himself into a chair across from Caleb. "You got the look of someone who won't let go." "I found things," Caleb said, "in the cabin. Documents, photos. My grandmother kept records." Horace nodded slowly. "She was smart, smarter than the rest of us." He reached for a shoebox on the table beside him and opened it carefully. Inside was a cassette tape, its label yellowed with age. "I've been holding on to this for 40 years, Horace said, "waiting for someone from your family to come back." He handed the tape to Caleb. "What's on it?" "Victor Kane, 1985. Threatening your grandmother." Horace's hands shook slightly. "I recorded it. I was there. I heard everything." Caleb stared at the tape, his pulse quickening. "Why didn't you come forward?" "Because I was afraid." Horace's voice cracked. "Victor's father had already made people disappear. I had a wife, a daughter. I convinced myself that silence was survival." He looked up at Caleb, his eyes wet. "But your grandma didn't have that luxury. She tried to protect you. That's why she ran." "Protect me from what?" Horace stood slowly, walking to a drawer. He pulled out a faded photograph and handed it to Caleb. It showed a stretch of mountain road. Route 7. A truck on its side, wheels in the air, metal crumpled. "Victor's father arranged an accident," Horace said. "Your grandfather was supposed to die. The brakes were sabotaged, but Dot found out the night before. She gave your grandfather money to take your father and disappear. Sent them to Texas." Caleb's hands went cold. "Your grandfather drove that truck instead of your father. He died so your father could live." The room tilted. Maverick pressed his body against Caleb's legs, sensing the shift. "Dot knew," Horace continued, "and she lived with that guilt every day. But she also made sure the truth didn't die with her." Caleb couldn't speak. Horace reached out and gripped his shoulder. "You're here because she believed someone would come. Someone strong enough to finish what she started." Caleb looked down at the cassette tape in his hand. "Can I borrow a player?" Horace nodded. They sat in silence as Horace retrieved an old cassette player from a closet and set it on the table. Caleb inserted the tape and pressed play. Static hissed for a moment, then a voice. Younger, but unmistakably Victor Kane. "You need to stop Dorothy. This doesn't end well for you." Dot's voice calm but firm. "I won't let you bury this. If you talk, your grandson won't make it to high school. Accidents happen on Route 7, you know that." A long pause, then Dot quieter now. "You're threatening a child. I'm protecting this town. Sometimes that requires hard choices." The tape clicked off. Caleb sat in the silence that followed, his chest tight, his breathing shallow. Maverick whined softly. Horace spoke quietly. "She ran to keep you alive, Caleb. And now you're the only one left who can make sure she didn't run for nothing." Caleb stood slowly, the tape clutched in his hand. "Thank you," he said. Horace nodded. "Finish it." Caleb and Maverick walked back to the truck in silence. The weight of the truth pressed down on him like a physical thing. His grandfather, dead because of a threat meant for his father. Dot, alone in the mountains for decades, carrying a secret too dangerous to speak. And him, the last Hardwick, the one who had to decide what came next. He climbed into the Tacoma and sat there, hands on the wheel, staring at nothing. Maverick nudged his arm. Caleb looked at the dog. "We're not running," he said. Maverick's tail thumped once. Caleb started the engine and drove back to Greer's shop. When he arrived, Silas was waiting, the USB drive connected to a laptop. "Got it," Silas said. "Most of it anyway." Caleb leaned over the screen. Files, dozens of them, emails, scanned documents, spreadsheets, all dated between 2003 and 2022, all signed by Victor Kane. Subject lines jumped out at him. Disposal protocol, zone secured, relocation complete. Caleb's jaw tightened. Silas pointed to one email in particular. From V, Kane to redacted date March 14th, 2003. Subject cleanup disposal complete. No traces remain. Hardwick property remains the primary risk. Monitor closely. Caleb read it 3 times. "She knew," he whispered. "She knew they buried people on her land." Silas nodded grimly. "And now you do too." Caleb copied the files onto a new drive, paid Silas, and walked back to the truck. Maverick was waiting in the passenger seat, watching him through the windshield. Caleb climbed in and sat for a moment, the new drive in his hand, the cassette tape from Horace in his pocket, and the weight of 60 years of silence pressing down on his shoulders. Then as he sat there in the truck outside Greer's shop, staring at the USB drive in his hand, a different weight settled over him. The weight of choice. He could leave now. Take the evidence to the state police, let them handle it. Get back to Arizona where things were simple, where the past stayed buried. His hand moved to the ignition. Maverick, sitting in the passenger seat, didn't move. "We're done here, Mav," Caleb said quietly. "We got what we came for." The dog remained still. Caleb turned the key. The engine started. Maverick stood up in his seat, placed both paws on the dashboard, and looked directly at Caleb. Then the dog turned his head toward the mountains, toward the forest, toward the truth still hidden in the trees. "No," Caleb said. "We're not doing this. It's not our fight." Maverick didn't budge. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Maverick, sit." The dog sat, but his eyes never left the mountains. A long silence filled the truck. Caleb's hands gripped the steering wheel. He thought about Marcus, about the mission he'd walked away from, about all the times he'd chosen survival over standing his ground. And he thought about Dot, living alone for 60 years, protecting a truth no one else would. "Damn it," Caleb whispered. He turned off the engine. Maverick's tail thumped once against the seat. "Okay," Caleb said, "we stay." The dog lay back down, resting his head on his paws. But his eyes were watching the mountains, waiting. Because Maverick had always known, some things you don't walk away from. That evening, as Caleb sat in the truck planning his next move, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. A silver sedan pulled up behind him and stopped. Maverick's ears pricked forward. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was in her early 40s, dressed in a gray business suit, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. She approached cautiously, hands visible, moving like someone who knew she was interrupting something. Caleb rolled down his window. "Mr. Hardwick," she asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "Who's asking?" "My name is Evelyn Kane." She paused, watching his reaction. "Victor Kane is my father." Maverick growled low. Caleb's hand moved to the door handle, but Evelyn took a step back. "I'm not here to threaten you," she said quickly. "I'm here because I found something. Something my father has been hiding." She held up a leather-bound ledger. Caleb didn't move. "I'm an environmental lawyer," Evelyn continued. "I've been reviewing old county records for a case. I found discrepancies in land transfers after the 1964 mudslide. When I asked my father about them, he told me to drop it." She looked down at the ledger. "I didn't. I went through his files, and I found this." She stepped closer, holding the book out through the window. Caleb took it. Inside were handwritten entries, dates, names, amounts paid for relocation services, and at the bottom of each page, a signature. "Victor Kane Sr." "There's more," Evelyn said. "I found emails on his computer, references to disposal, to cleanup, to your grandmother's property being a primary risk." Caleb looked up at her. "Why are you telling me this?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "Because I have a 7-year-old daughter, and I won't let her grow up believing the lie I was raised with." She wiped her eyes quickly, composing herself. "There's a memorial service tomorrow, 60th anniversary of the mudslide. My father will be there. The whole town will be there." She met Caleb's gaze. "If you're going to do this, that's when." She turned and walked back to her car. Caleb sat in the truck, staring at the ledger in his hands. Maverick nudged his arm. "Yeah," Caleb whispered. "I know." The pieces were falling into place. Then his radio crackled, the same voice from that morning. "Wildfire reported on the South Ridge. Winds shifting toward Shadow Ridge. Mandatory evacuation in effect. All residents advised to leave immediately." Caleb looked toward the southern mountains. A thin column of smoke rose into the sky, black and ominous. He looked at Maverick. The dog's ears were forward, alert. Caleb started the engine and drove toward the cabin as fast as the old logging road would allow. The truth was finally within reach. But the mountain wasn't done with them yet. The smoke was visible from miles away, a dark smudge against the afternoon sky that grew thicker with every passing minute. Caleb pushed the Tacoma as hard as he dared on the winding mountain road, gravel spraying beneath the tires as he took the curves faster than was safe. Maverick braced himself, body tense, eyes locked on the road ahead. By the time they reached the outskirts of Shadow Ridge, the evacuation was already underway. Families loaded possessions into trucks and SUVs. The sheriff's department had set up a checkpoint at the main intersection, directing traffic south toward the valley. A deputy flagged Caleb down as he approached. "Sir, you need to turn around. Fire's moving fast. We're evacuating everyone." I'm heading to my cabin to get supplies, Caleb said. No time for that. Fire's already jumped the ridge. You've got maybe an hour before it reaches the north side. Caleb's mind raced. The cabin, the evidence, the lockbox, Dot's journals, and the train car, the rusted rail car sitting 3 miles into the forest hidden among the pines. The physical proof of everything Dot had documented. The place where bodies were likely buried. If the fire reached it, the evidence would be destroyed. I need to go, Caleb said. The deputy shook his head. I can't let you do that. Caleb met his eyes. I'm going. He pressed the accelerator before the deputy could respond, the Tacoma lurching forward. In the rearview mirror, he saw the man reach for his radio, but Caleb was already gone, disappearing into the network of back roads that led toward the ridge. Maverick let out a short bark. Not alarm, acknowledgement. They were committed now. The road to the cabin was empty. Everyone with sense had already fled. The sky overhead had turned an ugly orange-gray, the sun blotted out by smoke. Ash began to fall like snow, drifting through the air in lazy spirals. Caleb reached the cabin and jumped out. Maverick followed, moving immediately into search mode, checking the perimeter. Caleb ran inside, grabbed the lockbox from beneath the floorboard, and stuffed it into his pack, along with Dot's journals and the cassette tape from Horace. He took one last look around the small space that had been his grandmother's sanctuary. Then he turned and ran back outside. But he didn't head for the truck. He looked north toward the forest where the train car sat hidden. Maverick was already there, waiting at the edge of the clearing, body pointed in that direction. The dog knew. Caleb pulled a bandana from his pack and tied it around his face. He soaked another in water from his canteen and secured it around Maverick's neck, a crude filter against the smoke. Let's go. They plunged into the forest. The smoke thickened as they moved deeper into the trees. Caleb's eyes watered and his lungs burned with each breath. The temperature was rising, the air itself growing hostile. Maverick led the way, nose low, navigating the familiar path toward the train car. But every few minutes, the dog would stop, ears swiveling, testing the wind. The fire was close. Caleb could hear it now. A low roar like distant thunder, the crack of burning trees, the rush of superheated air moving through the canopy. They broke into the clearing where the train car sat. It looked even more surreal in the haze of smoke, a ghost from another era, impossibly out of place. The old mining rail spur that had once serviced this area was long gone, reclaimed by the forest, but the car itself remained a monument to secrets long buried. Caleb ran to the door and wrenched it open. Inside, everything was as he'd left it. The desk, the maps, the steel box containing the IDs. He grabbed the box, his hands shaking. 12 metal tags, 12 families, 12 lives erased from history. This was the proof. Physical, undeniable. A sharp crack echoed through the forest. Caleb spun around. A massive pine, its trunk engulfed in flames, tilted slowly, then faster, falling directly toward the train car. Maverick, move! Caleb dove through the doorway just as the tree crashed down. The impact shook the ground, and the train car lurched violently to one side. Metal shrieked. The roof buckled. Caleb hit the ground hard, the steel box flying from his hands. He rolled, disoriented, smoke filling his lungs. Then he heard it, a sharp, high-pitched yelp, followed by silence. Maverick, Caleb scrambled to his feet, coughing, eyes streaming. Through the smoke, he saw the dog pinned beneath a section of burning wood that had broken off from the fallen tree. Maverick's hind leg was trapped, the weight of the timber pressing down. The dog wasn't moving. Everything else disappeared. The fire, the evidence, the mission. None of it mattered. Caleb ran to Maverick's side, dropping to his knees. The dog's eyes were open, watching him, but there was pain there. Deep pain. No, Caleb whispered. Not you. I won't lose you too. The memory of Marcus flashed through his mind. The weight of his friend's body, the blood, the helplessness. Not again. Caleb grabbed the crowbar he'd used to open the train car and wedged it under the timber. He threw his weight against it, muscles screaming, but the wood barely moved. The flames were getting closer. Heat radiated from all sides. The train car groaned, threatening to collapse entirely. Maverick whined once, a soft, almost apologetic sound. Don't you dare, Caleb said through gritted teeth. Don't you dare give up. He repositioned the crowbar, bracing his feet against a rock. This time when he pushed, the timber shifted. Just an inch. But it was enough. He pushed again. Harder. The wood lifted. Come on, Mav, move. The dog tried. His front legs scrabbled at the dirt, but the injured hind leg wouldn't respond. Caleb dropped the crowbar, grabbed Maverick by the harness, and pulled. The dog yelped again, but Caleb didn't stop. He dragged Maverick clear of the timber just as it rolled back into place, sending up a shower of sparks. He knelt beside the dog, hands moving over Maverick's body checking for injuries. The hind leg was badly bruised, possibly fractured, but the dog was breathing, conscious, alive. Relief flooded through Caleb so intense it nearly knocked him over. "We're getting out of here," he said. "Together, like always." He tore off his flannel shirt, wrapping it around Maverick's injured leg as a makeshift splint. Then he lifted the dog, carefully cradling him against his chest. Maverick was heavy, 65 pounds of muscle and bone. But Caleb had carried heavier loads through worse conditions. He turned back toward the train car. The steel box with the ID tags was just inside the doorway, blown clear by the impact. He couldn't carry both it and Maverick. For a moment he hesitated. Then Marcus's voice echoed in his memory, the last words his friend had spoken before he died. "Get out, Caleb. Don't stay for me." Caleb had stayed anyway, and Marcus had died. He looked down at Maverick, who was watching him with those steady amber eyes. "This time I'm not leaving anyone behind." He set Maverick down, gently grabbed the steel box and shoved it into his pack. Then he lifted the dog again and started running. The forest was an inferno now. Flames consumed the trees on all sides, the heat so intense that Caleb's exposed skin felt like it was blistering. Smoke choked the air, turning the world into a hellish twilight. But Maverick had trained for this. He'd navigated worse conditions overseas, leading teams through smoke and chaos. Even injured, even cradled in Caleb's arms, the dog's nose worked, guiding them through gaps in the flames that Caleb couldn't see. When Caleb veered left, Maverick growled. Caleb corrected, moving right. The dog's instincts were sharper than any GPS. They burst out of the tree line and into the clearing just as the roof of the cabin collapsed, consumed by fire. The Tacoma sat untouched 20 yards away. Caleb ran. He yanked open the passenger door, laid Maverick gently on the seat, and climbed behind the wheel. The engine roared to life and he floored the accelerator. The truck fishtailed on the loose gravel, then found traction and shot forward. Behind them, the forest exploded into a wall of flame. Caleb didn't look back. He drove until they reached the checkpoint, where the deputy who tried to stop him earlier stood with wide eyes. "Jesus Christ," the deputy said. "You're lucky to be alive." Caleb didn't respond. He just kept driving, heading toward the valley where the rest of Shadow Ridge's residents had gathered. Maverick lay on the seat beside him, breathing steadily. His tail thumped once against the leather. Caleb reached over and rested a hand on the dog's head. "You saved me again," he whispered. Maverick's eyes closed, not from pain, from trust. They were safe, and the evidence was with them. The evacuation center had been set up in the high school gymnasium 2 towns over. Families huddled on cots, children played in corners, and volunteers handed out sandwiches and bottled water. Caleb sat on the floor in a quiet corner, Maverick stretched out beside him. A local veterinarian had examined the dog and confirmed what Caleb had suspected. Deep bruising, no fracture. Rest and pain management for a week, and Maverick would recover. The steel box sat on the floor between them. Caleb opened it and looked at the 12 ID tags again. Each one engraved with a name, a date, a life. Thomas Holloway, Mary Chen, Robert Jennings. Families who had disappeared after the 1964 mudslide. Families Victor Kane's father had promised to relocate. Families who had never been seen again. Caleb's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., memorial service. 60th anniversary of the mudslide. Everyone will be there." He stared at the message. Then he texted back, "I'll be there." The next morning, Caleb dressed in the cleanest clothes he had, his olive field jacket, a fresh flannel shirt, his cargo pants, and boots. Maverick limped beside him, the injured leg wrapped in a proper bandage now, but the dog refused to stay behind. They drove to Shadow Ridge. The town square had been transformed. Chairs were arranged in rows facing a small stage. A banner hung overhead in memory of those lost, 1964. 200 people filled the seats, families, town officials, reporters from neighboring counties. And at the front, standing beside the podium, was Victor Kane. He wore a dark suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his expression solemn, the picture of a grieving community leader. Caleb and Maverick stood at the back unnoticed. Victor stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "Today, we honor the 37 lives lost in the mudslide of 1964, a tragedy that reshaped our community. But we survived it, together. We rebuilt, together, and our strength." Caleb started walking, every head turned. Maverick limped beside him, tail low, eyes forward. Victor's words faltered. His polished confidence cracked when their eyes met. Caleb stopped at the front row. "I'd like to add something to the historical record," he said. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman in the second row whispered, "That's Dorothy Hardwick's grandson." Victor forced a thin smile. "Mr. Hardwick, this is a private memorial." "The truth doesn't need an invitation," Caleb said. He reached into his pack and pulled out the steel box. He set it on the podium beside Victor's trembling hand. "My grandmother," Caleb said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd, "spent 60 years protecting evidence. Evidence of what really happened after the mudslide. Evidence that powerful people tried to bury." He opened the box. 12 metal ID tags spilled onto the podium. The crowd leaned forward. Caleb picked up the first tag and read the name aloud. "Thomas Holloway, relocated 1964. Never heard from again." He picked up the second. "Mary Chen, relocated 1964. Never heard from again." One by one he read all the 12 names. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Caleb pulled out the USB drive. "These are emails," he said, plugging the drive into a laptop that had been set up for a slideshow. "Written by Victor Kane between 2003 and 2022. The screen flickered to life. Subject disposal protocol. Disposal complete. No traces remain. Hardwick property remains the primary risk." Murmurs rose. People stood. Someone gasped. Caleb's hands were steady now. The tremor that had plagued him for years was gone. "My grandmother tried to stop this," he said. "She tried to speak up, and for that she was threatened, silenced, driven into the mountains to live alone." He pulled out the cassette player Horace had given him. "This is a recording from 1985. Victor Kane threatening my grandmother. Threatening me." He pressed play. Victor's voice filled the square. "If you talk, your grandson won't make it to high school. Accidents happen on Route 7. The crowd erupted. Victor staggered back, his face draining of color. That's not... Those are lies," he stammered. "Fabrications." Caleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "My grandmother kept records," he said. "Physical evidence, digital evidence, witness testimony. She kept it all because she knew this day might come." He turned to the crowd. 12 families were relocated after the mudslide. 12 families who trusted Victor Kane's father to help them rebuild. They were poisoned. Their bodies buried on land that's now mine. A woman in the front row stood, tears streaming down her face. "My grandfather was Thomas Holloway," she said, her voice breaking. "We never knew what happened to him." Others stood, one by one, descendants of the missing families. Victor looked around, wild-eyed, cornered. Then from the side of the square, a figure stepped forward. Evelyn Kane, Victor's daughter. She was dressed in a gray business suit, her face pale but determined. "Dad," she said quietly, "it's over." Victor stared at her. "Evelyn, what are you—" "I found your ledgers," she said. "I know what you did, what grandfather did." She walked to the podium and placed a leather-bound book beside the steel box. "This is a record of every payment made for disposal," she said. "Every bribe, every threat, every lie." The crowd was silent now, watching. Victor's knees buckled. He gripped the podium to steady himself. "I was protecting this town," he said, his voice hoarse. "If this gets out, Shadow Ridge dies." Caleb stepped closer. "Shadow Ridge died the day you buried the truth," he said. Two sheriff's deputies moved forward flanking Victor, but they didn't handcuff him, didn't drag him away. Victor simply straightened his coat, nodded once, and walked toward the waiting patrol car. No drama, no resistance, just a quiet surrender. The crowd watched in stunned silence as he climbed into the back seat and the car drove away. Evelyn remained at the podium, tears streaming down her face. "I have a daughter," she said to the crowd. "I won't let her grow up in the shadow of this." She looked at Caleb. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb nodded. Then from the back of the crowd, Horace Pike stood. He leaned heavily on his walker, but his voice was clear. "I was there," Horace said. "I heard Victor's father make threats. I saw what they did, and I said nothing." His voice cracked. "For 60 years, I said nothing. But Dorothy Hardwick was braver than all of us. And today her grandson finished what she started." The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then louder, stronger. Caleb stood at the podium, overwhelmed. Maverick pressed against his leg, grounding him. He looked out at the faces, some angry, some grieving, some relieved, all of them finally after 60 years free. 6 months later, the cabin was gone, consumed by the fire that had swept through the ridge. But in its place, something new had risen. The Hardwick Veterans Center stood where the cabin once did, a single-story building with wide windows overlooking the valley. Inside, there were counseling rooms, a library, a common area where veterans could gather, talk, heal. And in the back, a training facility where Maverick, fully recovered, worked with two younger German shepherds, teaching them the skills he'd learned overseas. Caleb stood on the porch watching the sun set over the ridge. The trees had begun to grow back, green shoots pushing through the charred earth. Maverick limped over and sat beside him, his injured leg still stiff but functional. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's head. "We did it," he said quietly. Maverick's tail thumped twice. In the valley below, the town of Shadow Ridge looked different now. Smaller maybe, quieter, but no longer haunted. Victor Kane had been arrested 3 days after the memorial. The evidence was overwhelming. Emails, ledgers, witness testimony from Horace and Evelyn. The state attorney general had taken over the case. But Victor was 78 years old and in failing health. His lawyers negotiated a plea deal. He would forfeit all assets to a victim's compensation fund and spend his remaining years under house arrest. It wasn't the justice Caleb had wanted, but Horace had put it best: sometimes the punishment is living with what you've done. Victor will die alone knowing the world sees him for what he really is. That's its own kind of hell. The 12 families had been exhumed, given proper burials, their names carved into a memorial stone in the town square. The exhumation had taken 3 months. Forensic teams worked carefully, identifying remains through dental records and the metal ID tags Caleb had found. One by one, the 12 families were brought home. The memorial service was held on a Saturday in April. The entire town attended. Caleb stood beside the new monument as a pastor read each name aloud. Thomas Holloway, Mary Chen, Robert Jennings. Descendants of the missing families stood in the front row holding photos of grandparents they'd never met. Some wept, others simply stood in silence, finally able to grieve. Jessie Holloway's mother placed flowers at the base of the stone, then turned to Caleb. "Thank you," she whispered. "My family can finally rest." Caleb nodded, unable to speak. Maverick sat beside him, watching the ceremony with those steady amber eyes. After the service, people approached Caleb. Strangers who shook his hand, families who thanked him, children who petted Maverick and asked if he was a hero. "Yes," Caleb said quietly, "he is." Evelyn had donated the Kane family fortune to the victims' fund. She'd moved away with her daughter, starting over somewhere far from the mountains. And Caleb had stayed, because that's what Dot had done. She had stayed, even when it cost her everything. A truck pulled up the dirt road. Jessie Holloway, now 10 years old, climbed out with his mother. "Mr. Hardwick," Jessie called, running toward the porch. Maverick stood, tail wagging, and the boy threw his arms around the dog's neck. Jessie's mother smiled at Caleb. "He wanted to see Maverick. Hope that's okay." "Always," Caleb said. He watched the boy and the dog play in the clearing, running through the new grass, the sound of laughter echoing off the mountains. This was what Dot had fought for. Not revenge, not vindication, just the simple right for the truth to exist, for the dead to be remembered, for the living to move forward without the weight of buried secrets. As the sun dipped below the ridge, Caleb walked back inside. On the wall of the common room, he'd hung 2 photographs. One of Dot standing in front of the old cabin, strong and defiant. One of himself and Maverick taken the day the center opened. Beside them, a plaque, in memory of Dorothy Hardwick, who refused to be silenced. Caleb stood there for a long moment, then turned and walked outside. Maverick was waiting, Jessie beside him. Later that evening, after Jessie and his mother had left, Caleb sat on the porch steps with Maverick beside him. The sun had set completely now, and the first stars were appearing in the clear mountain sky. Caleb reached over and scratched behind Maverick's ears. "You knew, didn't you?" he said quietly. "From the moment we got here, you knew we weren't leaving." Maverick's tail thumped twice against the wooden steps. Caleb smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. For the first time since Marcus died, the weight on his chest was gone. He wasn't running anymore. He was home. And Maverick, as always, was right beside him. Sometimes miracles don't come like lightning. Sometimes they come quiet, like a dog that stops when you'd rather keep walking, like the courage to stay when leaving is easier, like a stranger who chooses truth over family. In this story, Maverick refused to leave. Caleb chose to stay. Evelyn chose conscience over blood. Maybe that's how God works most often. He places something loyal beside us and waits to see if we'll honor it. In our daily lives, we face moments like this. Moments when it's easier to walk away than to stand firm. When silence feels safer than truth. When fear looms larger than conscience. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs it. Comment below. What moment stayed with you? Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, faith, and redemption. May God bless you and keep you. May He guide your steps through every fire, every fear. And may he place loyal companions beside you when you need them most. Amen.